Scene: the Alcazar of Seville, 1366. XT Alcazar Courtyard, day. Blood still dripped from the stones as the last screams faded into silence. In the courtyard of the Royal Alcazar of Seville, under the scorching sun of 1366, a man watched with feverish eyes the work he had just completed. His hands, still trembling with excitement, held a ruby-encrusted dagger, rubies that now vied in crimson with the stains decorating his royal robes. Peter I of Castile, whom history would know as the Cruel, had just personally executed 3 more of his subjects, this time with refinements of creativity that would make even the most experienced executioners blush. The stench of iron and urine hung heavy in the hot air, mingling with the scent of roses still blooming in the nearby gardens, an irony the king himself savored with morbid pleasure. At 42, Peter had reigned for nearly 2 decades over one of the most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. His appearance still impressed those who saw him for the first time. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with majestic bearing, he possessed the angular face typical of the House of Burgundy, with a prominent jaw that betrayed his royal lineage. His dark eyes, deep as wells, could shift between the most refined seduction and the most absolute coldness in a matter of seconds. His black hair, always perfectly groomed, contrasted with his carefully trimmed beard that framed thin lips, lips that could whisper words of love in the morning and order elaborate tortures by nightfall. The palace surrounding him was a living testament to his magnificence and power. Built with the finest materials brought from all over the known world, each room was a universe of luxury and ostentation. Gold-embroidered tapestries told stories of conquests and glories, while furniture carved by Moorish and Christian artisans blended in an almost impossible harmony. The walls, decorated with tiles that reflected the light like tiny suns, seemed to pulse with life of their own. In the corridors, the echo of footsteps mingled with the constant murmur of courtiers, creating a symphony of power that intoxicated any visitor. But behind this facade of splendor, something was beginning to rot. Servants whispered among themselves about strange noises coming from the dungeons during the night. Groans that didn't seem human, metallic screeches that made even the bravest cross themselves silently. The kitchens, once centers of joy and abundance, now operated in a climate of constant terror. The cooks worked with trembling hands, knowing that any dish that displeased the king could result in punishments that defied the darkest imagination. Peter's transformation into a monster didn't happen overnight. Born in 1334, the son of Alfonso XI of Castile and Maria of Portugal, he grew up surrounded by the luxuries of the court, but also by the intrigues, betrayals, and violence that defined medieval politics. His father, though recognized as an efficient king, maintained a tumultuous relationship with his wife, preferring the company of his mistress Leonor de Guzman, who bore him 10 illegitimate children. This situation created an atmosphere of constant tension in the palace, where young Peter learned early on that power was maintained through fear and the systematic elimination of enemies. Peter's childhood was marked by episodes that, in retrospect, seemed to foreshadow his future cruelty. At the age of 8, he was caught torturing small animals in the palace gardens, tearing off their legs one by one while observing their reactions with scientific fascination. When confronted by his nurse, he replied with disconcerting coldness, "I need to understand how suffering works, because one day I will rule men." This response, recorded in a letter from the nurse herself to her family, demonstrated a disturbing precocity in understanding the mechanisms of power. During his adolescence, Peter demonstrated exceptional intelligence, quickly mastering Latin, Arabic, and French, as well as excelling in mathematics and philosophy. His tutors described him as a young man of impressive intellectual capacity, able to solve complex problems with disconcerting ease. However, this same intelligence seemed to manifest itself in a sinister way when applied to human relations. At 16, he already manipulated courtiers with mastery, creating alliances and enmities as it suited him, always observing the reactions of his victims with the same scientific gaze he had once dedicated to animals. The death of his father in 1350, when Peter was only 16, marked the beginning of his ascent to absolute power. The coronation was a spectacle of magnificence that impressed all of Europe. Kings, princes, and ambassadors traveled from distant lands to witness the ceremony, which lasted 3 days and 3 uninterrupted nights. The young king, dressed in robes embroidered in gold and silver, seemed the incarnation of divine royalty. His presence was magnetic, his voice resonated with natural authority, and his gestures possessed an elegance that instantly captivated any observer. In the first years of his reign, Peter demonstrated exceptional administrative competence. He reorganized the judicial system, modernized the armed forces, and implemented economic policies that brought prosperity to the kingdom. The chroniclers of the time describe a just and efficient king, capable of working long hours without showing fatigue, always attentive to the smallest details of administration. His palace became a center of attraction for intellectuals, artists, and merchants from all over Europe, creating an atmosphere of cosmopolitanism and sophistication that rivaled the most refined courts of the continent. The royal chambers became a physical reflection of Peter's disturbed mind. The walls were covered with portraits of his executed enemies, each accompanied with a detailed description of the method used for their death. A central table displayed instruments of torture collected from across Europe, some adapted by the king himself to his specifications. Chroniclers who had access to these chambers described a suffocating atmosphere, where the scent of incense mingled with more sinister odors that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Peter's marriage to Blanche of Bourbon in 1353 should have marked a new phase of stability in his life, but instead it became the catalyst for his final transformation into a monster. The young French princess, only 17 years old, arrived in Castile surrounded with hopes and romantic illusions. Beautiful, cultured, and refined, she seemed the ideal wife for a rising king. However, Peter showed immediate disinterest in her, preferring the company of Maria of Padilla, a Castilian noblewoman who had become his mistress even before the wedding. The palace transformed into a labyrinth of terror where even the most loyal courtiers walked on eggshells. Peter developed a system of subtle signals, a prolonged gaze, a seemingly casual gesture, an ambiguous comment that invariably precedes some terrible punishment. This coded language created an atmosphere of permanent tension, where anyone could be the next victim without warning. The king's daily routine itself became a morbid celebration of his absolute power. He woke before dawn and dedicated the first hours of the day to reading reports on the activities of his subjects during the previous night. Any deviation from the considered normal was immediately investigated, frequently resulting in interrogations that he himself conducted with increasing expertise. After breakfast, which invariably included rare wines and imported delicacies, Peter would head to the palace dungeons, where he had installed what he called his laboratory of justice. This laboratory was a large room, well lit by strategically placed torches to avoid shadows that might conceal any detail. The walls were covered with shelves displaying instruments of torture from all over Europe, some modified by Peter himself to his specifications. A scribe was always present, meticulously recording each procedure, each reaction, each word uttered by the victims. Peter later studied these records as if they were scientific treatises, constantly seeking to perfect his methods. Peter's cruelty wasn't limited to political enemies or common criminals. He developed a particular obsession with people he considered interesting, individuals whose personalities or personal stories aroused his morbid curiosity. Poets, philosophers, artists, and even men of the church were occasionally selected for his experiments, not for any specific crime, but simply because Peter wished to understand how they worked. One of the most documented cases of this period was that of the troubadour Macias, known as the Enamored One. Macias had composed passionate verses for a lady of the court, and Peter, feigning interest in poetic art, invited him to recite personally in his chambers. What began as a cultural presentation turned into an elaborate torture session, where Peter systematically tested the limits of the poet's physical and emotional resistance. According to records of the time, Peter kept Macias alive for weeks, alternating moments of torture with periods of medical care to prolong his suffering. News of his methods spread through neighboring kingdoms via merchants, diplomats, and refugees who managed to escape Castile. Peter became a legendary figure of terror, his name whispered in taverns and courts across Europe. Paradoxically, this sinister reputation also increased his political power, as other kings preferred to negotiate with him rather than face his wrath. Maria of Padilla, the mistress who had caused the break with Blanche, became a constant and unsettling presence in Peter's life. She not only passively accepted the king's cruelty, but seemed to actively encourage it. Chroniclers of the time describe a woman of extraordinary beauty, but with a calculating and ambitious personality, who used her influence over Peter to eliminate rivals and consolidate her power. Together, they formed a couple that combined sophisticated intelligence with systematic cruelty. Maria had a particular gift for identifying people's emotional weaknesses, information she shared with Peter during their long nocturnal conversations. She maintained a network of informants among the women of the court, collecting intimate secrets that were later used for blackmail or psychological torture. Her presence in the royal chambers during torture sessions was so regular that many considered her the true mastermind behind Peter's most refined methods. If you seek to understand the dark complexities of history and human nature, subscribe to our channel to follow more accounts exploring the most disturbing and fascinating aspects of absolute power. In 1356, Peter made a decision that would shock even his most loyal supporters. He ordered the assassination of Fadrique Alfonso, master of Santiago, and his half-brother. The crime was committed in the presence of dozens of guests, including foreign ambassadors, transforming what should have been a diplomatic celebration into a spectacle of horror. Peter not only ordered the execution, but actively participated in it, using an ornamental dagger to mortally wound Fadrique while the guests watched in terrified silence. From this public display of violence, Peter lost any pretense of normalcy. He had crossed an invisible line separating tyrant from psychopath, and there was no turning back. The following months were marked by an escalation of violence that seemed endless. Nobles, clergy, merchants, and even servants were executed for increasingly trivial offenses. A look interpreted as disrespectful, a word spoken in a tone deemed inappropriate, even a smile at the wrong moment could result in death. Peter himself began to manifest physical signs of his mental degradation. Witnesses describe dramatic changes in his appearance. His face, once noble and harmonious, acquired hardened features and eyes that seemed to burn with a permanent fever. He developed nervous tics, mainly a compulsive hand movement that simulated the act of strangulation. His sleep became erratic, interspersed with nightmares that made him scream during the night, waking the entire palace. Peter's diet also changed drastically. He developed extreme paranoia about poisoning, insisting that every dish be tasted by multiple tasters before he touched it. Paradoxically, this obsession with his own safety contrasted with the increasing recklessness of his political actions. He systematically alienated all possible allies, creating a circle of enemies that constantly expanded. During this period, Peter developed a morbid interest in detailed records of his atrocities. He ordered specialized scribes to document each execution, each torture, each moment of inflicted suffering. These documents were organized into elaborate archives with indexes that allowed for quick retrieval of information on specific methods, victims' reactions, and the effectiveness of different procedures. For Peter, this information constituted a kind of scientific library of human suffering. The political situation deteriorated rapidly. The Castilian nobility, traditionally divided into rival factions, began to unite in opposition to the king. The clergy, initially neutral, began to openly denounce Peter's methods, comparing him to biblical tyrants. Even the common people, who initially supported the king against the nobility, began to whisper about the need for change. In 1366, the situation reached a critical point. Henry of Trastamara, Peter's illegitimate half-brother, returned from French exile with an army of mercenaries willing to overthrow the king. What Peter failed to realize, blinded by his obsession with cruelty, was that he had created the perfect conditions for his own destruction. By systematically eliminating any internal opposition, he had also eliminated the defense mechanisms that could protect him from external threats. The ensuing civil war was brutal and devastating. Peter, who had spent decades perfecting methods of individual torture, proved completely incapable of dealing with the complexity of a large-scale military conflict. His armies, composed mainly of mercenaries who fought for money and not for loyalty, deserted en masse as soon as the situation became unfavorable. During the final months of 1366, Peter became a shadow of his former self. The man who had terrorized an entire kingdom now hid in isolated fortresses, jumping from castle to castle in a desperate flight. His appearance deteriorated drastically. His hair, once impeccably styled, now hung in oily, unkempt strands. His face, marked by deep wrinkles and bloodshot eyes, seemed to have aged decades in a few months. What most disturbed those who saw him during this period was the transformation in his personality. Peter, who had been the embodiment of arrogant confidence, now showed signs of extreme paranoia. He saw betrayal in every gesture, conspiracy in every word. Even Maria of Padilla, his most constant companion, was occasionally treated with suspicion and threats. The cruelty that had once been calculated and systematic became erratic and desperate. In March 1367, Peter suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Nájera. His army was utterly annihilated, and he himself barely escaped capture. From that moment, his situation became untenable. Sheltered in Seville with a handful of loyal followers, Peter lived out his final days as king, surrounded by an oppressive silence that starkly contrasted with the terror his presence had inspired for decades. The irony of the situation didn't escape Peter. The man who had dedicated his life to studying the suffering of others now experienced a form of agony that none of his methods had been able to reproduce. It was the existential suffering of absolute power dissolving, of identity disintegrating, of reality revealing itself as illusion. His days were filled with an emptiness that no torture could fill, no execution could satisfy. During the final weeks of his life, Peter displayed moments of terrifying lucidity when he seemed to fully grasp the monstrous nature of his actions. These epiphanies, however, brought not repentance, but an even deeper despair. He had become something that transcended normal humanity, but in the process had lost any possibility of redemption or peace. Peter's death arrived on March 23, 1369, during the Battle of Montel. Confronted personally by his half-brother Henry, Peter demonstrated one last time his contradictory nature. Despite all his cruelty, he faced death with impressive physical courage, fighting to the last moment with the same intensity he had dedicated to torture. Henry, after overpowering him in hand-to-hand combat, killed him with a dagger, the same kind of weapon Peter had used against so many victims. Peter's last words, recorded by chroniclers present at the scene, were, "Finally, I understand." This enigmatic phrase has been interpreted in various ways by historians, but many believe it represented a final moment of understanding about the self-destructive nature of absolute power wielded without moral limits. Peter's death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a legend that would endure for centuries. His reign became a paradigmatic example of how absolute power can transform a man into a monster, and how systematic cruelty invariably turns against its own creator. Peter's story is not just the account of an individual tyrant, but a meditation on the nature of human evil and the limits of civilization. Peter's palace, the scene of so many atrocities, was later purified and reconsecrated, but it never fully shed the sinister aura that surrounded it. Visitors reported strange sensations, inexplicable noises, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, as if the violence perpetrated there had permanently permeated the physical environment. The figure of Peter the Cruel remains one of the most extreme examples of how absolute power can completely corrupt human nature. His story reveals that cruelty is not just an individual aberration, but can become a system of government when there are no effective mechanisms to control it. Peter's reign demonstrates that civilization is a fragile construct, constantly threatened by the possibility that individuals with unlimited power will succumb to the darkest temptations of human nature. His legacy endures not only as a historical warning, but as a reflection on the eternal dangers of authoritarianism and the excessive concentration of power. Peter was not just a cruel king, but the architect of a system where cruelty became a method of government, where terror became state policy, and where humanity was sacrificed on the altar of a power that devoured itself. The tragedy of Peter the Cruel is also the tragedy of the human condition when devoid of ethical limits and institutional controls. His story remains relevant because it reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the fragility of the structures that protect society against humanity's most destructive impulses. In Peter, we see not only a historical monster, but a dark mirror reflecting latent possibilities in any society that allows the absolute concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. The kingdom Peter left behind was devastated not only by civil war, but by the moral corrosion that his cruelty had spread throughout all layers of society. Subsequent generations would need decades to rebuild not only the physical structures of power, but also the ethical values and institutions that make civilized coexistence possible. Peter's shadow extended far beyond his death, forever reminding us that humanity carries within itself both the capacity for greatness and for the most absolute monstrosity.